Good afternoon. I'm Ken Tannenbaum with the Kilmer Group. The Kilmer Group is a family business that's had the great privilege of being a part of our city building story for 3 generations. As the corporate sponsor of this session, Richard has offered me 3 minutes to set the table, and I will just take 1 minute to make 3 points. First, thank you all for being here. The work you are doing in fulfilling the mission of ULI is of profound importance to Canada and to the world as humanity continues to urbanize. Second, in whatever role each of us plays, we must all cherish and be outstanding stewards to our city region, which is a beacon on the planet for multiculturalism and pluralism. And finally, our city region is in fact an island, bounded by Lake Ontario, the Niagara Escarpment, the Oak Ridges Moraine, and the Greenbelt. There are 7 million people living on our island, and we're adding 150,000 net new migrants each year. To ensure a bright future, we need to employ deep systems thinking in determining where people live, where they work, where they get medical care, where they get education. And these challenges need to be framed in a context of social equity, efficient transportation, and the creation of a vibrant public realm. To address the challenges of city building in this context, we couldn't be more fortunate to have the panel we do, and I will turn the podium over to Jennifer Keesmaat, Chief Planner of the City of Toronto, to kick things off. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Ken. I too am encouraged by Ken, as Ken is, by the city builders in the room who are deeply committed to creating a great livable region. This panel is intended to raise some issues around the unprecedented growth that we see in the city. I'm going to paint a portrait by giving the very high-level overview of the growth that we see. And really, it is about identifying and recognizing that we are at a pivotal moment in the history of our city. And how we proceed today will have implications that will reverberate for generations and generations. For this reason, we're conscious that we need to think carefully. Despite the fact that growth is happening very quickly, in some ways we need to pause and move slowly and be reflective of the implications of the vast change that we in fact see today. This panel will be talking a little bit about the high-level picture of the city, some of the specific growth that's happening in the downtown core, and then there will be 2 speakers speaking to both public realm and its important role in the evolving city, as well as architecture. To paint the portrait, our city is becoming something fundamentally different than what it was in the past. This is good. It needs to become something fundamentally different. It means that we need to embrace innovation, that we need to think in new ways about every kind of system in the city, whether it be housing and thinking about living in new ways, or movement and thinking about moving in new ways in the city, or whether it be about nature and thinking about the relationship between the city and nature in an urban environment as being something fundamentally different than what we have planned for in the past. You can see here the incredible volume of proposed residential developments that are scattered throughout the entire city. But of course, there's a great clustering taking place in the downtown core. In many ways, this is an outcome of our successful planning policy over the course of the past 40 years. 40 years ago, in the Central Area Plan, there was in fact a strategy put in place to drive growth into the core. We are now delivering on that promise, and we're seeing it in hyperspeed in a way that we never quite imagined. This presents an opportunity and challenges with respect to our infrastructure. The good news is we are also seeing significant non-residential development also across the entire city. Some of you may recall when I started out over 15 years ago, it must be longer than that, as a planner, there was a talk of a reverse commute. Do you remember those conversations? That's what everyone was buzzing about. There were two things. We were buzzing about the brain drain, how smart people were leaving this country and leaving this city, and we were buzzing about the reverse commute, that people were in fact living in the core, but working outside of the core. Well, as a result of a whole variety of policies, but also some larger forces, including shifting consumer preferences, which was something that really wasn't anticipated to happen and to be unleashed on the scale that it has been unleashed, we are in fact seeing that both residential growth as well as non-residential development is being driven right into the heart of the city. But the pace of this growth has in fact accelerated only very recently. If you look at this chart, the middle line is the growth taking place in the downtown core. You'll see that about 16 years ago, the rest of the GTA was growing really at an exceptional pace in comparison to the City of Toronto and the downtown. Now, the Greenbelt is a very important part of this narrative in shifting the pattern of growth. And this is good because the objective of the Greenbelt was to direct growth to existing, already built up places. And we see that this is accelerated in a way that in fact wasn't quite anticipated by our policy frameworks or by the infrastructure that we have in fact put in place. Just take a look at our skyline in 2004. This is our skyline in 2016. This is an astronomical amount of change. And I'm always a bit surprised when people talk to me about NIMBYism in Toronto. There's not a lot of cities that have in fact embraced and accommodated the magnitude of change over such a short period of time as we have here in the Toronto context. And this is a really important part of our story. When we in fact get growth right, when we deliver on the promise of creating better places, more walkable places with high quality design, we in fact see that we can accelerate growth. When we deliver on the promise, the residents in this city are very willing to accept change. And this is one of the reasons why we have been able to accelerate the pace of growth in the City of Toronto. But we also know that there's more to come. When I started this job as chief planner almost 5 years ago now, I was interviewed by a reporter who said to me, you know, Toronto's grown so much over the past 10 years, like, aren't you sort of late to the party? Like, there's not much that's going to be happening. So much has happened already. Well, I can tell you that we have kind of a running joke in the city planning department that we're waiting for the lull. You know that lull when you can catch up and clean up your desk and read the reports that you never quite finished reading? We've been waiting for the lull. Well, for 5 years, we have been in hyperspeed, moving from one opportunity to the next. We thought the pace of growth was unprecedented 5 years ago. And then it ratcheted up a little bit more. And then the next year, it ratcheted up even a little bit more. Every year over the past 5 years, we have seen an unprecedented amount of activity with respect to development in our city. And we know, and we're naive to think otherwise, that there is in fact more to come. We know that there are going to be, by 2041, over, I would argue, 3.5 million residents living right here in the heart of the City of Toronto. Now, it's important to go back to that very first statement about becoming something fundamentally different than we have been. Could you imagine if every one of those new residents came with a car? Could you imagine if every one of those new residents assumed that they were going to have a single-family house with a garage and a large yard? Well, it's physically impossible. It defies the laws of physics that we can add more people and add more cars and that our living spaces will continue to get bigger and bigger. We know that we need to embrace a fundamentally new way of living in our city, that we need to think about dense urban places and how they can be designed to offer a very high quality of life. And a big part of this is about design of the urban realm as well as of buildings, but it's also about getting our public space right. Now, interestingly, you can see here right in the heart of the downtown. So the entire city is 613 square kilometers. Remember, we used to be 7 cities. 613 square kilometers, absolutely massive in terms of its scale. Just to give you an example, in London, that would be 7 different fare zones on transit, the entire city of Toronto. What you see here is just 17 square kilometers. This is the downtown core. And you can see here in terms of the changes that we expect, that a significant amount of that change is really centered very much where our policies have been directing growth. And one of the great successes of our city, a very important narrative of our city, is of course the two kings. And you can see the red area there, which is accommodating the most intensification, is the King Spadina area. But we fully anticipate that the entire waterfront will continue to add new communities and new density. And we need to ensure that we have the water infrastructure, the transit infrastructure, the energy infrastructure to be able to deliver a high quality of life in a mixed-use environment right in the heart of the city in a way that is connected to a much lower environmental footprint. And this brings us to a really critical and important question, which is, what kind of a city do we want to become? If we are becoming something different, we do need to continue to draw ourselves back to this higher question, to think about the vision, and to ensure that as we accommodate this growth, as we change, as we become something fundamentally different, that we are aligning our policies with that vision, that we're delivering on the ground in keeping with that higher vision. Now you can see here our City of Toronto Urban Structure Plan. This is from our official plan policy. And this is really the most important map in the context of our official plan, because this map actually builds the narrative of the kind of city that we want to become. It sort of sets the stage, if you will, for the story. Now, this map is going to be revised a little bit in the context of an urban structure review that we're undertaking in 2018. But the integrity of the big ideas in this map still hold, and they still convey some very important ideas about the kind of city that we want to become. And one of the big ideas actually has to do with our ravine system. And we're bringing forward to City Council a ravine strategy. 17% of the land area in our city is ravines, the natural systems that sustain human life. Environmentally sensitive areas that we've identified, and we're now going to be creating management plans for those areas, recognizing where we want growth to go and where we don't want growth to grow is a critical part of linking back into that vision of the kind of city that we want to become. We want to be a green city. We want to ensure that no matter where you live in the city, that you have access to nature, to green space, to parks. And I'll talk a little bit about our Parks Master Plan a little bit later in the slide presentation. But the ravine system is a really critical backbone to the entire city. Another important part of the narrative that we can begin to see in this urban structure actually has to do with our street network. 25% of the land area in the city are streets. They are in the city's ownership. And we've just completed Complete Streets guidelines that are about recognizing that we can actually turn our streets into something fundamentally different than they are today. Remember all those new people coming? Well, they're not getting in cars because, well, our road system's actually been at capacity since the 70s. The Gardiner Expressway was at capacity 10 years after it opened. So we know that, simple physics, there is no more room for more cars. So looking at our street infrastructure and redefining that street infrastructure to actually begin to serve the people in the city and how people move in the city is a critical part of our vision. So widening sidewalks, adding cycling infrastructure, adding higher order transit along our street network is a critical part of ensuring that long-term, sustainable, walkable city is materialized in how we build out the future city. Now, you see the kind of mustard yellow area in the center. That's the downtown where most of that growth is being accommodated. But we also have suburban centers. There's a Yonge and Eglinton Centre, which is growing very, very quickly. But then we have the Scarborough Town Centre, and we're currently doing a transportation master plan in the Scarborough Town Centre to turn it into an urban place, because it's not that today. The blocks are much too large. There's flyovers that constrain pedestrian movement. So creating a finer grained block structure in the Scarborough Centre is a critical part on delivering on the opportunity of having more employment closer to where people work. You also see the North York Centre. We have a vision, Reimagine Yonge, that is about taking Yonge Street, which goes right through the heart of that centre, and it currently really acts like a highway. It serves as a barrier, transforming it to make it a connection, making it a place where cyclists are safe, making it a place for urban life to unfold. And then on the far west side of the city, the red dot you see is the 6 Points interchange, the new Etobicoke civic precinct, which is currently being created. And there's a public meeting later on this evening to reveal the outcomes of a design competition for creating a new civic center in Etobicoke so that we can create that urban heart. But importantly, I haven't yet talked about the linear stretches that you see in the map. Those are our corridors that can accommodate, in some areas, a significant amount of intensification, but mostly a mid-rise form. There's a tremendous amount of development capacity that can be accommodated on those corridors. And what's so exciting about this is that when we add mid-rise development in the heart of an existing suburban area, we add a mix of uses, the opportunity for new jobs, destinations within walking distance of existing homes. We begin to transform the way people move and live within their neighborhood towards a much more sustainable kind of urban place. So there's an opportunity to use all of this growth that we see coming forward in our city really as a tool to deliver on the vision of a safer, more sustainable city where people have a whole variety of options in terms of how they can move around in their neighborhood. Sometimes you can walk, sometimes you can cycle, sometimes you can take a short transit ride to get to your destination. In too many of our places in our city today, the best way to get from point A to point B is in a car. What we heard last night in the presentation at Meet the Chiefs from Martin, he talked about old 20th century ideas in the city that we must undo if we're seriously committed to addressing the climate mitigation challenges that we need to address in our cities. We need to repair those areas of the city that were based on a series of principles that are fundamentally problematic. Our avenues are a critical way to deliver on this promise. And we've undertaken 19 avenue studies. All of those avenues have already been upzoned. The zoning exists in order to add more density on those corridors. But we also have a series of additional growth-related planning studies. I'm not going to speak to all of them, but they identify areas where we recognize significant change can take place in order to better deliver on the vision. And one of them I'll just highlight for you is the Golden Mile Secondary Plan, because this is an area that currently looks like any typical big box center, and it's an area that we can in fact transform into a walkable urban place. In order to deliver on this vision, there's a series of big moves that are required, and one of them is, in fact, an integrated transit system. This is our rapid transit network today. This is our rapid trans work currently being built within the next 6 years. And you can see here on this map, the King Street Transit Priority Corridor. We're going to be bringing forward a recommendation in July to City Council, recommending turning a portion of King Street into a transit priority corridor, making transit first. You can see here the Eglinton Crosstown, 19 kilometers of LRT, currently under construction right through the heart of the city, and then of course the Finch LRT. Now, this is the network that we recommend to be built within the next 15 years. And we brought this forward to City Council of June of 2015, and Council has endorsed us advancing this framework. And so a whole variety of these projects are all being advanced consecutively. Now, concurrently, sorry, very important to distinguish that. They're being advanced at the same time. So you can see here, remember that red spot on the map, that growth pattern where so much of the growth is going? Look at that blue line along the bottom. That's the waterfront LRT. The waterfront LRT is a critical part of the rapid transit network that we need to build in this city in order to accommodate the growth that we already know is coming, and also to ensure that we're delivering on the vision of a walkable, sustainable, transit-oriented city. And this is the full build-out that you see. You see Eglinton East and Eglinton West. You see a whole variety of additional projects that will build out that network. A key part of this is linked to complete streets. Transit and complete streets go hand in hand. Mobility choice is about having a variety of options and being able to embrace the right option at the right moment in your everyday life. And it might be that you commute on transit, but you can walk or cycle within your neighborhood to get from place to place. We know that delivering on a high-quality public realm is essential as we densify the city. The more we get people out into public space, the more the quality of the public realm and the durability of the public realm is essential to our everyday quality of life. We also know that complete communities are how we deliver on complete streets and how we deliver on a transit-oriented city. The opportunity to do a whole variety of things within your neighborhood is, in fact, a key driver behind a multimodal city. The risk, of course, is that we're stuck with the long commute forever. The risk is that we assume that the long commute is always going to be a part of our everyday life. But complete communities and planning for complete communities is about bringing a whole variety of uses in close in such a way that we have a variety of choices. Now, some of you may be thinking, she must be crazy if she thinks that's a complete community. But in fact, this is a transition slide. What you see here is right where we are today building LRT, right through the heart of our Scarborough suburb. That was a strange slip. This is the Golden Mile, where we are currently creating a secondary plan for a higher level of intensification. This is, in fact, the framework for that same corridor. You can see the LRT in the center. This is the framework that was approved in principle by City Council when we brought forward our focused areas as part of the Eglinton LRT built form framework. You can see the objective is to add density, to bring buildings up to the edge of the street, and to create an environment where you can do a whole variety of things within walking distance, but where you also have choices. You can walk, you can cycle, you can take transit. We can take places that currently look like this, where you really only have one choice. You could walk, there's a sidewalk, but really, who's kidding who? You're not going to walk here. Why would you? And you know, I'm not sure when this picture was taken, but if you were in this area on a Sunday morning, you would know it's absolute mayhem. Couldn't be more frustrating because of the traffic congestion. What we want to do is create places that are resilient over time because they provide a whole variety of choices that are fundamentally more efficient in terms of how we use the infrastructure. Transit is more efficient, cycling is more efficient, walking is more efficient. You need the density to be able to deliver on each one of those various efficiencies. And the great news in our city is that many places in our city actually look like the previous picture. We can add lots more people and at the same time deliver in creating a better city. We also want to design for children. And this is a critical part of creating complete communities. We want to think very carefully about how children can thrive in urban environments, how the quality of life offer in our high-density environments can be even better than the quality of life offer in our lower-density environments. And it's not lost on me that the first generation that grew up in the second ring of suburbs, the first generation that grew up with the long commute as part of everyday life, is currently saying, you know what, screw it. I actually want to live in the downtown. I don't mind that I don't have a yard because I've got a great local park, and I don't mind having less space because I get to walk to work and I don't have a long commute. It shouldn't be lost on us that there's a generation today that is making a fundamentally different choice precisely because of the way the long commute compromised their everyday life. We also recognize that we need to celebrate our natural environment, and our ravine strategy is about ensuring that we protect, invest, and connect that natural environment into the urban systems that exist in our city. We know we need to invest in quality of life infrastructure. If we accommodate growth, but we don't invest in the infrastructure that delivers on the promise, we in fact put not only the future of our city at risk, we put the future of our health at risk, but we put the future of our planet at risk, because it is in our cities where we can fundamentally reduce our environmental footprint. In our planning for TO Core, we are looking at everything from buildings to public spaces to mobility, community, facilities, affordable daycare, economy, water, as well as energy infrastructure, recognizing that we need to connect the dots and create a comprehensive secondary plan in our downtown to deliver on this vision. And an essential part of that is our Parks and Public Realm Master Plan. And this master plan was about recognizing that there's a variety of different scales of types of parks and open spaces that are really the hooks that we will hang all of this density and all of this urban life upon. And you can see here Rail Deck Park as part of a larger stitching together of the entire waterfront. It really becomes an essential component of how we link together a variety of spaces in that rapidly urbanizing core. And here it is. You can see it in the context of Fort York and in other public spaces in the downtown. This is what the rail infrastructure looks like today. And this is, of course, the vision for how it can become a fundamental and critical part of the everyday life of our city. Thank you very much.
Here we go, thanks. I'm actually relatively new to this role, but I have been around city planning for a number of years. In fact, long enough to be part of the corporate memory, I guess. And so what I'd like to do is share with you a few of my observations over the last 20 or 25 years about the big city building moves that I've been part of. And actually my big observation is that it takes time. In fact, it takes more than time to do some of these big moves. It takes a lot of vision, it takes a lot of leadership, it takes patience, it takes a thick skin, it takes tenacity, and it takes the right toolkit to get some of these ideas through to actual fruition. And it also takes a really strong toolkit to make sure that we are implementing the vision that we actually want. Thank you, Jennifer, for introducing this map, because I always like to start my presentations with the urban structure of the map, of the city. And as Jennifer said, this is the bones upon which we hang the growth and the vision of the city, and it really directs where we see the growth of the city happening. But what's interesting to me is to remember that Council adopted this in 2002, and in fact the background work and the consultations for this map are in some cases up to 20 years old. And so when I look at it now, it does start to look a little bit outdated and a little bit antiquated. And so we do recognize that there are aspects of our urban structure map that we do need to start updating. And in fact, there are a series of urban design policies that we are working on updating right now. To name a few, I think the public realm, as I said, is the bone of the city. And if we don't get that right as we go incrementally through individual developments or through these big city building moves, we're not going to have the healthy community that we are striving for. And that includes the pedestrian realm for everybody. Whether you're a driver or a transit rider or a cyclist, we all begin and end our journeys as pedestrians. So it's critical to get that realm right. And to make sure that we've got places for sitting, for walking, whether they're in public places or in private places in all weather. It's really important that we get these policies right and we develop them properly. One of the other issues that we're struggling with, as Jennifer said, is the overwhelming interest in re-urbanizing our avenues. We have 19 studies completed already, but we continue to envision how they will evolve through the neighborhoods. And in 2010, Council did adopt performance standards for the Midrise Buildings. And what we've seen is close to 300 applications, some of them already built, for this building type. So it's a very exciting time to be part of the city. But what we have learned through these, in the last, I guess, 7 years, is that there are some aspects of the performance standards that we do need to work on. We need to look at getting building entrances better articulated to support the public realm. We need to get the upper massing better. We need to be thinking about how we use the rooftops and how we transition to the rear. Another set of urban design policies that the 2002 plan had was the tall building guidelines, and they spoke very clearly about the base, the middle, and the top of towers. I don't think what they anticipated at the time, nobody could anticipate the level of interest that we've had in the tall buildings that we've seen in the last 10 years, 15 years. And so we are paying a little more attention to that, particularly when you realize that we are the #1 tall building city in North America compared to any other city. And I do think this is not something that we envisioned, and it's something that we could not possibly have envisioned, the level of interest in tall building. And so I think it's time for a pause to look backwards and ask ourselves, what are we not envisioning now that we probably should be? So I want to share with you a couple of quick case studies about the two areas that are adjacent to the rail deck park. And with apologies to those of you in the room who have a lot more detailed information, I'm just sharing some of my involvement and some of my observations about these two areas. So if you look at the downtown area, this is what it looks like today. 35 years ago, it was really different. And it actually, in my memory, 35 years ago is not that long ago, but it's a very, very different place. And so if we look ahead 35 years, it's going to be significantly different again. Whoops, is this going? There we go. So what I wanted to share with you just a little bit was about King Spadina on the north side of the rail deck park and City Place on the south side of the rail deck park. Just to orient yourself, Bathurst on the left and Spadina roughly in the middle of the map there. And so the question I'll be asking myself as we work through these slides is, did we get it right? Were we thinking the right thoughts 20 years ago or not? When we look back 21 years ago on King Spadina, we realized that there was actually a need for change. There was pressure to revitalize some of the old manufacturing buildings that were being abandoned, and there wasn't really the planning tools to manage the regeneration of that area. If you look around, the things that were happening in Detroit, the core was being bulldozed down. 42nd Street in New York was being revitalized. We were looking at our own Gooder and Moritz lands and wondering what could we possibly use them for. And we were looking at Dundas Square and wondering if we could revitalize it. It was a time of a lot of change and a lot of optimism. When we talk about the Kings, for those of you that are not familiar, they're basically the shoulders of downtown. The office centers were downtown and the residential stable lands were further afield. But these areas were no longer stable. As I said, the manufacturing jobs were leaving and there was no planning regime in place to manage the change. Historically, it had been a very vibrant employment area. and it was recognized to have regional importance for that reason. It had a series of unique public spaces and special streets, and it had a high concentration of historic buildings. The question was what to do with them. The 1996 approach was radical at the time. The idea was to loosen the restrictive land uses, the land use controls, and emphasize the built form in terms of compatible buildings and uses, in terms of compatible new buildings. It was intended to kickstart development and speed up the conversion of the empty, obsolete factories that were littering the area. It didn't happen by accident. It was actually quite controversial at the time, and if it wasn't for the risk-taking champions, Paul Bedford and Mayor Barbara Hall at the time, I don't think any of this would have happened. There was a serious pushback from council. In fact, when we talk about the hand-wringers today on the rail deck park, there were plenty of naysayers and hand-wringers at the time. People were saying that we couldn't possibly have a 24-hour neighborhood, that there was a lack of traditional services and infrastructure, and there was a lack of understanding about the future demographic of the city. Who are we going to be? And we couldn't possibly imagine the diversity that was coming to Toronto. The plan was eventually passed, and the payoff was seen to be the preservation of old buildings and a revitalized downtown. The primary tool at the time was an urban-based structure plan. And I just want to spend a minute talking about this. It is 20 years old now, and some of it has come to fruition and some of it hasn't. But the idea was that the streets of the area would be clearly defined with street edges, that there was sunlight on the streets and the open spaces, and there were strict height limits to restrict that to ensure the sunlight. So heights were limited to 12 to 30 meters. Views and connections through and across the area were very, very important, as you see through the arrows, and there were a series of special streets identified. The plan at the time also expanded the uses to include things that would encourage live, work, and play, and with particular attention to incubating the arts in the area. The plan removed density, it preserved the heritage building, and it relaxed parking standards. By 1999, we were starting to see not only the conversion of some of the existing buildings, but new buildings that mimic the style in terms of the height and the density. They were actually very compatible buildings. And if you go out there today, I've got a model here that really focuses on the east section of King Spadina. You do see much of this redevelopment starting to happen. But what's harder to see is these buildings now are, some of them under construction, how they're going to contribute to the sunlight on the space and this urban neighborhood that was being envisioned. If you go out, what you don't know by looking at that is that there are even more developments that have been approved but not yet constructed. So as you can see, some of those basic tenets of the 1996 plan have been pierced, but others have been preserved. And what's even more difficult to imagine is the number of applications that have been submitted and are under review right now. So it's a challenging problem to deal with. Is it livable? Did we get the vision right 20 years ago, or are we needing to manage this in a different way? What astonishes me is the number of people that are coming to live here. By 2025, an estimated 40,000 people. And I like to ask myself, who are these people? There are children, there are grandchildren. What kind of lives will they be living? Did we properly envision it? Did we properly set it up? And what unexpected changes will take place in the next 20 years that we need to work on today? So just to segue finally to the railway lands is the area immediately south of the rail deck park as it's imagined now. Of course, the planning there started 40 and 50 years ago, but the current plan that we're working from started some 20 years ago. It has always held an iconic place in the city. It's been the front door to the city from the waterfront. It's been the way you come to the east and the west through the rail corridor, Fort York on the west, Rogers Centre in the middle, and the Sky Dome on the west. At the time, I think 20 years ago, I don't think there was a single residential unit in this area. The 1987 plan, I think, apologies for the quality of this, I think this was done with colored pencils. The planning regime anticipated the long-term incremental growth of the area as a mid-rise neighborhood, facing the water, kind of sandwiched between the rail corridor and the Gardiner Expressway, but what was new at the time was really trying to address the waterfront to these lands. In 1997, Canada Land sold this to Concord ADEX as a piece, and they were a Vancouver-based developer with experience in tall, slender towers. It was not really part of our vocabulary at the time, and it was seen as highly controversial. There were headlines about building an instant slum, about no track record building new developments and new neighborhoods with this scale and this density, so it was seen as very risky. So the city undertook a secondary plan to manage the growth and the change from the kind of the mid-rise neighborhood to this tall, slender tower neighborhood. And again, just to give you context, we were doing a secondary plan for the whole of the area, railway lands east, west, and central, concurrent with an application for the Air Canada Centre at the same time on the eastern side. So the resulting the secondary plan and urban design guidelines in this case came forward with a similar kind of structure plan that spoke to, in this case, street walls and anticipating a fine grain of pedestrian scale. It also spoke to where the towers should be located. It tried to define the open spaces and the community amenity, and it sought to make sure that there were views and connections. And I like to look at this map because what you can see is the seam, which is now the proposed rail deck park, between King Spadina on the north side and the City Place on the south side. And there are a few arrows anticipating views and one arrow anticipating a connection. So we got a little bit of it right, I guess. In fact, that one arrow is now the Puente de Toulouse Bridge, which I love to see and think that that's anticipating some of the views that we're going to see back and forth. The plan also really anticipated a fine grain of development. So there was guidance given to building setbacks, landscape, streetscape, ground floor uses in order to make sure that this thing could build out incrementally and have a lively public realm and street life throughout the course of the phasing. And if you go out there today, you can start to see some of that actually occur at the finer grain and the pedestrian scale. By 2002, there was the first building on Spadina. This one always impresses me because it takes up the grade change from north to south as you go along Spadina, and it really was the vanguard of the area. By 2009, we had the park built and the opening of the public art, which really started to draw a lot of people into the area. And by 2014, we have the library opening, and what we're looking to now is the development of the school and the community center adjacent to the park. And I would just like to conclude with this one picture because it shows in the background King Spadina, in the foreground City Place, and in the middle, hopefully in my lifetime, the rail deck park. So thank you very much. And co-founder of Public Work, and is a landscape architect and urban designer with over 15 years experience in the UK, USA, and Canada. Public Work is currently leading several ambitious transformational citywide initiatives, such as the TO Core Study for Parks and Public Realm, the King Street West Transit Project, and the Bentway, a new public space situated under the Gardiner. Adam is a Toronto Design Review Panel member and a regular critic and speaker on urban issues.
Okay, forwards, backwards. Hi, everyone. It's a real honor to speak in front of a group such as this and actually to follow some of the presenters that I'm following. So if I sound nervous, it's because I am. I wanted to start by talking about this word, culture. When Mark and myself started Public Work in 2012 now, and actually pretty much every day since, we've talked a lot about this in terms of the work that we want to do, picking up on the culture of place, and maybe if we're lucky, even making work which is a catalyst for culture. But it's one of those words which it's easier to give an example of it than to explain it. The most interesting way I heard it explained was that, let's go back to that. Was that culture is a product of our shared imagination. It's actually just stories that we create and share, and as long as we all believe in them, then it's a real thing. And they can bring us together. This guy, Yuval Harari, wrote, "Every man-made order is packed with internal contradictions. Cultures are constantly trying to reconcile these contradictions, and this process fuels change." I hope what he was saying was that when we come together in these large groups, with all our differences, that maybe something exceptional can happen. And maybe that's at the heart of city building. Now, in times past, these kind of contradictions, such as, live, work, industry, we tackled them by separating. So we pulled the different uses apart, and this was really the birth of planning as zoning, separating things out. And if you look back at the Toronto of, say, pre-1970s, you can see that in actuality. We had a central business district, and then we lived around the area of the core. We traveled in, we moved out again. And maybe what we're now seeing, and you don't have to take my word for it, just read Richard Florida, right? But we're seeing this revival of the information city, and really its fuel is proximity. So here, this density is actually a tool. It's putting us close together, and it actually accelerates the exchange of information and ideas, and that's really at the heart of our success, and that's why Toronto is such a global success now. And I can tell that this slide didn't quite translate from mine to PowerPoint. So what you would have been seeing here, and I'm just thinking of the other 10 slides, they're going to be the same. What you would have been seeing here is this is Eglinton Park, and when you look at some of the kind of post-war parks and streets and how they translated from that kind of era of zoning, we see some of the kind of same attitudes where uses are separated out so that they can be permitted and bylawed and often fenced from each other. And maybe as we look at streets as well, we can see that same kind of legacy. But, when we planned streets in the last few decades, we always just kind of put everyone in their box. So you drive here, you walk here, and it was a fairly simple equation that through time actually maybe drove out the kind of individual characteristics of what were once actually really interesting spaces. And as the chief planner said, constituting 25% of the area of our city. So density creates new challenges, and we all know that, I think, or agree that a great park system is actually tantamount for having a competitive city, but this traditional resource hasn't kept up with our growth and intensification. So as a result, we're actually getting pushed towards fairly unconventional solutions for public realm and open space. And maybe because of these kind of frictions, the results are actually really interesting and dynamic. I'm going to show you a couple of planning projects and then some hopefully soon to be built projects which can kind of demonstrate that, we hope. First of all, these words open and dense, open space and density. It seems to be central to the conversation now because this is the current contradiction we're all trying to reconcile. How can we be both? So the first project, if this was in around about 2012, we were asked to look at Yonge and Eglinton as a major growth center and try and understand and compose its public realm and open space system. So if you know Yonge and Eglinton, it's got a kind of a schizophrenic nature. You have that intense kind of pulsing heart of Yonge and Eglinton itself, a growth center, but then around it is a very different kind of street network and a neighborhood fabric. Low-rise or tower in the park, actually plenty of trees, very lush and green. How do you marry these two things together? I won't go into detail, but what we did was come up with 5 moves which were, we called them hybrids because they weren't any one thing. It wasn't simply an answer by a park or a street design. It was a combination of all these things together which composed unique systems which were interlinked. It was a clue, we thought, as to how we can start to string together or retrofit a city in terms of its public open space in the instance that you aren't starting over again, such as an area of brownfield redevelopment. Building on that, so now fast forward to 2015, we got the chance to do this on a larger scale, actually on the scale of a city. So people were just talking about TO Core. We were tackling one of the modules, still are, in terms of the Parks and Public Realm plan. So we wanted to think of public space as not just, I mean, some people say it's the space between buildings, and it is, but it's so much more than that. And we wanted to start to maybe celebrate and amplify its importance by considering all the scales that affect your daily life. So think about the biggest scale that you can experience this at. You may not get it every day, but think about the biggest impact it can have on your city, and maybe more than any skyline, how it might even define your city. Think about the scale in between, the scale of your district or your neighborhood, that which you experience on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. And then think even of the local supports, the hyper-local things which you experience even just as you step outside of your door. It's all public realm. It's different, but somehow could we find a way that it works together? I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So the first scale, we called it reimagining our civic identity because we thought in Toronto's case it could. We composed another series of moves. There was more here because we were dealing with the whole city. The first one was, it was really building on a topic you just heard about, the ravines, but recognizing that there is a landscape around our city. It almost cradles it. And when you look at the city proper, you start to see that the parks and public realm system is actually a remnant of what this landscape has left behind. Our city grew into this landscape. It wasn't the other way around. So in reading this landscape, we thought that the opportunity here was to expand and reconnect this system as a counterpoint to our urban form and a resource for our urban life. Looking at Toronto's in this instance, you can actually trace the history of what was here before the city by looking at the landscape around it. In the north, you've got, that was actually the shoreline of Lake Iroquois. Toronto itself used to be in a lake. On the east side, of course, you have the Don River Valley, and I think Jeff Cape was here before, and he probably talked a lot about that. There's an amazing resource for the city. To the south, the peninsulas and the islands, the ones that were before, are the ones that sprung up as we started to excavate the city and we built the spit. This process of symbiosis with the actual construction of the city. And then in the west, the Garrison Creek, all the parks you see there, look at the ridges through them. You'll see traces of the landscape was there before. Counter to that, but working with it, and actually, again, building on that notion of streets, we wanted to look at how, well, we wanted to pick 11 streets, and these 11 streets would be the ones we agreed really defined Toronto. And we maybe found that they'd all, through a process of engineering, become fairly similar, but could we grab back their identity, recognizing that they connect all these open spaces together, but because of the concession grid being built within this larger landscape frame, they actually connect to the larger landscape. The middle scale, this notion of districts, we wanted to talk about districts as public space. So, excuse me. We wanted to recognize districts as public space. We wanted to talk about parks, yes, and local parks, but even ask the question, could the feeling of being in a park extend deeper into a district? And could the very fact that the spacing, the cadence, and the fabric of streets is unique to different districts, that makes it special? And that's kind of a great reason for living in Toronto. We talked about portal parks. We used the word portal because we imagine parks which unlock a bigger experience. So I'm giving you an example of Corktown Common by Michael van Valkenburg. He speculated that, putting this park here would unlock a bigger open space system. So, for instance, this is looking at how it connects into the Lower Don Valley. It made the park punch above its weight. We found there was actually many of these opportunities around the core to connect into the bigger systems. And then also park district anchors, like all of the local districts which could connect out to these bigger systems. The last one was getting hyperlocal. We were targeting these kind of local scale interventions to complement this larger figure. And if you count them all up, there's about 150 hectares. That's about half Central Park of parkettes, laneways, schoolyards, pubs, churchyards. They're all used for something now, but if we could either design them differently, like rethink this amenity, or maybe even have different policies which govern them, then there's a massive amount of space where we can unlock new possibilities. And that excited us to think about that. Okay, that slide just got really messed up in translation. Keep going. That would have said it's great to think as well that these scales can work together. You can't just tackle one and solve a problem. You have to tackle them together. So then we started to think of 6 things which might be a clue as to how we reconsider public space in the new millennium. First one is obvious, I think. Maybe you've heard this a lot. This is the second day. Connect. Allow existing and new future public spaces to be assembled as coherent, connected systems. Expand. Expand territory, maybe even expand our goals. New funding mechanisms that might further enable individual developments to play a part of a broader system. So how do we make everyone play well together? Reimagine. Imagine the retrofit of active or decommissioned infrastructure as public spaces and civic amenities. A lot of cities have already done this, and sometimes they did it happenstance, but there are opportunities out there which we can realize. And they become more important as we creep towards this larger densities. Mix. So design new parks or improve existing ones so that they can accommodate these overlapping users and uses. And maybe it happens at different times of the day. So we're looking at whether places can just be more flexible. Like if you're living in a small house, you use every room for something different at different times of the day. Why can't your city be the same? And to share. When you have limited space, again, you have to change the rules around how you use the spaces that you already have. We're given the example here of quite a famous one of New York's schools to playgrounds. So they made the simple observation that when the school isn't using it, why should it stay not used? Open it up, let people use it as a park or a playground. The last one, rediscover. Before there was a city, there was a landscape. So to consider our pre-urban wilderness and lost waterways as a means to reinvigorate our urban lives. Just 3 projects. I wanted to highlight 3 projects which may be built on these 6 kind of mandates, and were just that little bit different. The kind of thing you might just not have done 10 or 20 years ago. The first one is the Sky Park at 45 Bay. We were surprised when a developer came to us with the prospect of designing a park over the rail corridor next to Union Station. It's not an everyday occurrence. But it excited us. It excited us to try and think of a different kind of space, one which leverages views and different aspects of being in a city. But we recognized here that the primary challenge was going to be, how do you get people up there? How do you convince them that that vitality, which we just take for granted on street level, can actually migrate up to the 5th level, the 5th story level? You've already heard a bunch about Raildeck Park. But here, the 45 Bay Park, that was an acre. Here's a chance for a 20-acre park. But the difference here is, of course, as the rail heads off into the west end of a city, instead of being on a bridge over the street, it's in cut now, and it's going under street. So the prospect of covering it becomes actually quite feasible in terms of a grade level that you get next to regular streets and how easy it could be to build a park there and have people access it. And the land prices, of course, suggest that building it may not be such a bad idea because the cost of constructing it balances out. It's also interesting that we've been thinking of an idea in Toronto for a couple of 100 years called Walks and Gardens. So this is 199 years ago. The Plan of York by Lieutenant Philpotts. It spoke of a waterfront walk, which we now have. We just have it further south. and it connected the Garrison Reserves and the Kings Park. So as our city developed, it moved south, as we all know. We built out, we landfilled, and the area which for walks and gardens would have been in is now in the rail corridor. It was interesting to note when we put the rail deck park over it, we actually found that this could be the fulfillment of an idea of 200 years ago, at least for the western half, and that made it quite poignant for us. How it would look, of course, and again, you've seen the rendering before, but what I want you to notice here is the relationship to street level and the kind of density that's anticipated around it. So, of course, making a park is a legacy. It's something that remains, as far as we know, forever, and it's hard to think of an area in the city that could use it more. The last one is called the Bentway, or Under Gardner. This is an exceptional project because it was brought to us by Ken Greenberg, who was working with Will and Judy Matthews, who you'd probably have to be living on the moon to not know that they'd donated $25 million of their own funds to make this happen. And they approached the city and the waterfront to work together with them to not build a wing on a hospital or put their name onto an amphitheater, but they wanted to build a public realm project. They wanted their legacy to be the public realm. We call it a missing link or a hidden terrain because a lot of the times we move past this place, but we don't notice it. We drive over it, we walk past it, but it's hidden only because we haven't imagined what it could be. And when we looked at this, we thought that it's actually an incredible space. It's formed by the fact that, of course, usually when you're underneath Gardner, Lakeshore's following it, so you're in a car underneath the Gardner. It's like a double-stacked highway. But just as you get towards Fort York, Lakeshore peels away, and this expansive territory opens up, which we can best describe as something like a civic arcade. It's 5 stories high. It's a cathedral-like space. And it's already had pioneering uses go into it by the visitor center at Fort York occupying it. So, and I should say also, the light quality under there is amazing. Like, whenever we're asked about this project, we always say, well, it must be dark under there. But because of the height, the level of light quality is quite stunning, and actually the contrast of light and dark is pretty breathtaking. So we started to imagine what this could be, and I think the most compelling thing we could think of, but it wouldn't be like a traditional park because it doesn't come from a traditional place of making a park. So could we imagine that every time you went there, that this could be completely diverse, completely multifunctional, and always different every time you visited? Like, wouldn't that be incredible to go to a place and every time you go, it's different? And only in Toronto. But this had to be not an imitation of something someone else has done in a similar situation. This has to be ours. So we started to imagine how we could fulfill that, and we worked with Artscape and now the Conservancy to imagine how we could actually have performances under here, how we could have gathering places, how we could put enabling infrastructure in which could be scripted to a limitless list of possibilities. We imagined that the infrastructure we add, instead of putting it in a conventional way, that we could actually leverage the infrastructure we already have there, the Gardner itself. So we even imagined and hope to build soon a bridge which connects the area from east of Fort York over to the west, hung off the Gardner itself. Luckily, they left us a little bit of capacity in the original engineering that we could do that. And if you're around this winter and all things going well, we'll be able to skate there too. Thanks, everyone. That's all I have.
Thanks, Adam. It's my pleasure now to introduce Brigitte Shim. Brigitte is an architect and principal of Shim-Sutcliffe Architects and a professor at the University of Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. Brigitte Shim and her partner Howard Sutcliffe have received 14 Governor General medals and awards for architecture and an American Institute of Architects National Honor Award. Brigitte Shim is a member of Waterfront Toronto's Design Review Panel and has served on the board of Build Toronto, the National Capital Commission's Committee on Planning and Design, and the University of Toronto's Design Review Panel. In January of 2013, Brigitte, Shim, and Shim-Sutcliffe were both awarded the Order of Canada for their contributions as architects designing sophisticated structures that represent the best of Canadian design to the world. Welcome, Brigitte.
Great. So first of all, thank you so much. Can everyone hear at the back? It's good. So first of all, this is a really important series of conversations discussing the future of a city we care deeply about. There are many Torontos. There's the city of ravines, the dynamic and evolving suburban Toronto, the urban core with its new and historic fabric, and the alternate system of back alleys and laneways. So what I want to do is just touch upon some of these important issues, really looking at built work that really addresses some of these questions. The distinguished writer Robert Fulford described Toronto's ravines as their chief characteristic of the local terrain. He called it its topographical signature. This is a view by Stephen Evans of the Don Valley in winter. Our earliest work experimented with the ravine edge, using retaining walls, grade beams, fountains, and 1.5 tons of rusting steel to link the tableland to the ravine slope. We made man-made ravine edges with concrete, wood, water, and stone, reshaping our understanding of the line between city and ravine. Many of our projects are small in scale, but claim a much larger territory through landscape. We're always creating new foregrounds to the natural ravine as a background. We're always interlocking water and ravine, water and sky. We always love the way that water in winter is capable of registering subtle shifts of temperature that we often are unable to perceive. Our Toronto ravines are the most northerly limit of the verdant Carolinian forest, starting in the southern United States. This project brings the ravine inside, water jet cutting leaf patterns of the black locust, one of the predominant trees of our ravine, out of atmospheric steel. Our buildings follow the natural contour line and oscillate between defining the urban fabric and the Toronto ravine edge. This is a home for the Sisters of St. Joseph in East York. This is a view of the same building from the neighborhood. And with our partners ERA, we retained and revitalized the 1850s Taylor House and incorporated it into a new ensemble. We used vertical sunshades and powder-coated aluminum with weathering steel to create an urban porch, linking the Sisters to the residential neighborhood. This is a view of the lobby, where you can see the neighborhood on the right, our thin lobby with wooden benches lining both sides, then a reflecting pool, the ravine landscape beyond, and finally the chapel to the left. We're always trying to pull the ravine landscape from the outside into our buildings and simultaneously push our buildings into nature. This is a winter view of the ravine landscape, looking at the public spaces on the left with the main chapel straight ahead. The Integral House, a special ravine project for us which helped reshape our relationship to nature in the middle of the largest city in the country. The project is only 2 stories from its entry and urban approach from the residential neighborhood. We love painting with light, especially with our low winter light raking across the landscape. We like to make spaces that traverse the ravine slope inside rather than outside. We like creating articulated clearings in the forest. We like to continue down the ravine slope to the valley, continually moving between inside and out. The Integral House creates a new cultural space in the city, and many musicians have told us that playing in the space is like being in a musical instrument. Howard and I designed a new dining hall for a wilderness camp founded in 1912, serving children and youth in poverty in Toronto for over 100 years. The camp was founded by Canon J.W. Moore, an Anglican minister, and they took children out of the urban slums of Toronto to benefit from fresh air and nature. We designed a a space that was made up of 2x4s that shaped the light and natural ventilation. After completing this seasonal building, Moorlands Community Services asked me to join the board of their nonprofit charity. I learned so much from serving their community. The downtown church workers, which was our original client, the little old ladies from the Anglican Church, served the inner community of Regents Park for decades. In the mid-1990s, they chose to focus exclusively on the neighborhoods of Thorncliffe Park and Flemington Park. The Toronto journalist Doug Saunders stated that new immigrants almost entirely arrive in the inner suburbs or the inner parts of the outer suburbs in cheap high-rise housing. This makes it difficult for them to do everyday things. If they're lucky enough to have a job and afford childcare, it takes them 3 hours each way on transit to get there and back. This creates a lack of economic opportunity and a disconnect between family members. So in a way, what happened in 2002 is that the little old ladies from the Anglican Church changed their name to Moorland Community Services to better reflect the multicultural, multi-faith, and multi-ethnic community that they had become, while still honoring their inspired beginnings with the church. Moorland still operates this wilderness camp in the summer, but also provides after-school programs for youth and leadership programs, filling in the gaps for the working poor and the immigrant communities, and reshaping our definition of the suburbs. The Canadian wilderness is viewed as often the Rocky Mountains, the prairies, and the forest. It's often how we market ourselves to the rest of the world. The reality for most new Canadians is not the natural landscape, but a man-made landscape of suburbia. This is a clip from Adam Egoyan's 1991 film, The Adjuster. The insurance adjuster becomes intimate with his clients. The suburbs is the backdrop for this film, and the suburbs continue to evolve due to global migration, and their transformation is inextricably linked to Toronto's future. In Doug Saunders' book, Arrival City, he describes rural and urban migration patterns that are seen across the globe. He describes each arrival city, newcomers, who typically settle amongst immigrants with similar ethno-cultural traits, where they strongly rely on informal social networks to establish themselves within their new environments. In 2016, the Venice Architecture Biennale's German pavilion was a collaboration between the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt and Doug Saunders, and they worked with him to create Arrival Country. The German pavilion was inspired by Toronto's Saunders asking tough questions. How is the largest migration in history reshaping our world? What conditions must be met in arrival cities from an urban planning and architecture perspective for immigrants to integrate successfully into Germany? The Toronto migration experience is being shared and discussed around the world, and we need to continue work on this very important unfinished project. Suburban Toronto is an assembly of former farm fields that's been annexed, amalgamated into various townships, boroughs, and cities. In this aerial view, the north side of the street is Markham, and the south side of the street is Toronto. You can see suburban cul-de-sacs, strip malls, corner gas stations. We worked with a group called the Fong Loi Guk Institute, whose members are predominantly non-Asian, but follow a blend of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, with Tai Chi as an important part of their practice. They bought a former single-family house on the north side of Steeles, hoping to create a sacred space. In this area, there was already a large mosque, a Buddhist temple, and a synagogue, which continually annoyed local residents with parking cars on residential streets. The city of Markham responded with bylaws requiring huge parking counts for space of worship. This building we designed was clad in atmospheric steel with irregularly spaced fins and floor-to-ceiling windows for natural ventilation. We responded to the requirement for parking by a 10.2-meter cantilever on the left side and a 5-meter cantilever on the right, creating a poised, balanced building. We also supported all of this on 7 concrete piers with a raft foundation below, providing lots of parking. The Tai Chi movement called single whip is an asymmetrical pose that demands inner balance and was the inspiration for the project. Exterior terraces bring light to the lower level parking area while also protecting the privacy of both the temple congregants and their neighbors. Bright red light monitors provide supports for hanging circular cones of incense while also shaping the filtered light entering this place of worship. Toronto is being reinvented and transformed by the local and the numerous immigrant communities who have chosen the suburbs as their home. I look forward to the remarkable metamorphosis of Toronto's suburbs, a place of invention and a place of our future. Creating public space is challenging. Public space in the suburbs is even more challenging. A while ago, we were asked by the Parks and Recreation Department of the City of Toronto to design a space that interweaves architecture and landscape. These are the before shots, Ledbury Park, defined by chain link fences, dilapidated skating rink, baseball diamond, and swimming facilities. The project creates an urban experience linking residential neighborhoods, a local public school, using walkways, pedestrian bridges, and landscape ramps. The outdoor swimming pool is defined by brick garden walls, and a pedestrian bridge hovers over the reflecting pool and skating canal. Pedestrians on the bridge view skaters below, skaters skate under the bridge. The reflecting pool in the canal viewed from the north looking to the south, and the use of winter water to animate a small suburban plaza. In a way, our Toronto urban fabric needs to be continually revitalized and reinvented. The most enlightened approach to sustainability is to value the existing historic fabric and to provide new and vital uses for its re-inhabitation. Distillery District, which was founded in 1830, has one of the largest complexes of industrial buildings in North America and is one of the architectural treasures of our city. The Pure Spirits building contained vats for distilling rye, whiskey, and rum. The parallel brick walls supported liquid-filled heavy metal vats. Existing brick walls were retained and recontextualized, carving new spaces for contemporary art. Existing wooden columns are combined with new metal bases. Existing skylights were retained, providing natural light. Existing brick arches used for servicing industrial vats were repurposed to create new gallery circulation. The City of Toronto also needs strong fabric buildings that reinforce existing neighborhoods while asserting our contemporary time. This is a view of Scollard Street in Yorkville. The north side of Scollard is designated as heritage. The south side is not. This dense urban neighborhood is defined by north-south pedestrian passages linking east-west shopping streets. This is a view from Yorkville looking north. This is the same view looking further north to our urban infill project. We struggled with the staff of preservation services at the City of Toronto, who felt that the adjacent 1970s buildings should be emulated and replicated. The interior courtyard brings light into the center while ensuring views of the city beyond. We truly believe that modern buildings have the capacity to contribute to the urban fabric of our cities in positive ways. Residential prices in Toronto are forecast to grow 20 to 25% this year, up from their estimates of 10 to 15%, according to TD Economics. We really need to find alternate forms of densification in our urban core that utilizes existing infrastructure. Google Street View has finally developed a trike that has started documenting Toronto's back lanes. Our invisible system of laneways is finally starting to become visible. At the University of Toronto with my students, we've studied laneways in Melbourne, Australia, London, England, Tokyo, Japan, and Toronto, Canada. Laneway housing is an idea whose time has finally come. There are many lessons we can learn from other cities. In London, the stables are now some of the most desirable real estate in the entire city. In Tokyo, there are many vehicles for firefighting, including motorcycle firefighters who serve its extensive laneway system, highlighted in yellow. Toronto's back alleys were laid out in our urban core at the exact same time as our streets by British surveyors. In a way, we've done a lot of work studying and analyzing this 2,400-kilometer system of laneways, understood the kind of qualities it has. In 2003, with my colleague Donald Chong and 13 University of Toronto Masters of Architecture, Landscape, and Urban Design students, we examined the potential of Toronto laneways. And we received their kind of big award, even though it was done with a group of architecture students. In the jury comments, Lisa Rochant said, about 2 million newcomers are expected to join Toronto in the next 20 years, but where to put them? One option is to house people in suburban developments on agricultural fringes of our city, and the other is to transform the city's brownfields and extensive laneways into sites for innovative and sensitive housing. So in a way, I feel like we're ready, and in a way, the architecture schools are really capable of generating the intellectual capital and the creative equity for the future of our city. I live in a back alley. Sorry, this is the project. I live in a back alley. I've been there for 20 years. I've raised 2 kids there. And we have a garden wall that enables pickup trucks and laneway housing to coexist. Spaces in the back alley are shaped by concrete block inside and out. The middle of the house is filled with natural light, which defines its interior landscape. As our cities become denser, we need humane outdoor spaces that connect us to nature in the middle of the largest metropolitan city in the country. Winter water in the urban core is a magnet for birds en route to the Leslie Street spit. The same laneway house is viewed from the outside looking in, with the same concrete block garden wall and the pickup trucks on the other side. Within this 2,400 kilometers of laneway is another project on Craven Road, 1,100 square feet, built for $100,000, providing affordable infill in the core. We also designed a studio later with the neighbor's garage to create an urban ensemble in the back alley. The upper portion of the space contains wooden light coffers, creating filtered light. And this space is shaped by natural light. On the left is a view of the Boulevard Tower, designed by architect George Robb in 1955. In a way, it's a glass and steel tower, the first of its kind in Toronto. And in 1985, despite the protests of architects, preservationists, and urbanists, such as Jane Jacobs, the tower was demolished for a one-day Molson Indy car race. In a way, I was one of those architects who unsuccessfully tried to save this tower, and as a response, I was part of a group called the Bureau of Architecture and Urbanism. We wanted to create awareness about our modern heritage. We mounted an exhibition in the rotunda of City Hall with the accompanying catalog. We also held a symposium in the council chamber. At the Toronto Modern Symposium, the late Barbara Frum was our moderator, and she said it was easier to love your grandparents than your parents. We were trying to help Toronto learn to love this exuberant period of post-war architecture, which, like our parents, was a bit too close at that time to fully appreciate. We selected 10 exemplary buildings to celebrate its history. And the final building in our Toronto Modern catalog was the new City Hall, which started as an international competition in 1958, the most significant city building event in post-war Toronto at the time. This is a photo of the opening ceremonies, September 13th, 1965, and the building and its civic square projected a confidence, a belief in modernity, and a positive future for Toronto to the rest of the world. We have come a long way from 1965, and we have much to be proud of. Toronto's waterfront was previously underused and underappreciated. The effort of many has initiated a remarkable transformation to realize a priceless and very unique public asset that is accessible to everyone. It is a crucial part of this revitalization is the use of architectural competitions to raise the bar for excellence and setting new standards for architecture and design and the public realm. In 2006, I was the chair of this waterfront design competition, along with Adam Egoyan and Ken Griedberg, Bruce Mao, Claude Cormier, Lisanne Couture, and we selected a firm called West 8. 11 years later, we are only now able to see the results of this really long but really worthwhile design process. And for decades to come, the citizens of Toronto will be able to enjoy this new public realm. Waterfront Toronto has always put people first and worked hard to connect them to the waterfront. They've emphasized parks and public space and led by landscape. What you're seeing is on your right-hand side is Corktown Common, which was mentioned before, and on the right is Sugar Beach. Both public spaces have created identity and joy for those who use them and are really the cornerstones of their community. In 2005, Waterfront Toronto created the first design panel to help ensure that their projects exceeded our standards for design excellence. And I am one of many architects, landscape architects, and urban designers who volunteer their time on this Waterfront Design Review panel, those on the City of Toronto Design Review panel, and the Toronto Community Housing Design panel. So many people are working hard in this city to raise the bar and really continue the legacy of this city that we care about. In closing, Toronto is experiencing this unprecedented growth, which has been discussed. For all of this growth, we have seen a lot of building, but very little architecture. I didn't see a lot of architecture in all those slides that were up there. And for all of its humanistic aspirations, architecture is usually perceived as having a very particularly needy connection to power and capital. Architects depend on capital to build. If construction depends on capital, the inverse is also true. An enormous amount of capital depends on architecture. The construction industry, which we are all part of, represents trillions of building dollars to our economy each year. Architects, landscape architects, urban designers, and planners are agents of change. We bring not only construction dollars, but lasting design value by creating beloved public spaces and buildings which reflect who we are as a society and what we value. We need to mobilize our collective voice to contribute to the collective act of city building, which goes beyond any professional discipline or interest group. Sorry. So maybe, oops, sorry about that. So maybe in closing, I just want to end with a bit of the last slide that I had that I flipped through. But at Phyllis Lambert's 90th birthday, she actually wrote that you must put up a building which expresses the best of a society in which you live. We have stellar examples like the new City Hall, which expresses the best of the society that we live in. Our new City Hall is a physical beacon that we are proud of, celebrating its 50th birthday last year. We are pleased that the City of Toronto held an international competition for the revitalization of Nathan Phillips Square with amazing results. And we hope that future Torontonians will celebrate future birthdays of our new City Hall and the City of Toronto, which represents and continues to represent optimism and enthusiasm for our city. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alex Bozikovic. I'm the architecture critic for the Globe and Mail. Thank you all for coming today, and I am pleased to be the moderator for our final panel. The panelists will be the speakers we've just heard, Brigitte, Adam, Not Lorna, but Jennifer. And also we're going to be joined by one more, Michael Leckman. Hey, Michael. So Michael is a principal at Diamond Schmidt Architects, and he has been recognized over his 28 years there for design excellence, leadership in energy efficient design, and for shaping the critical debate as chair of Toronto's design review panel. He's also contributed to the profession as a guest critic at schools of architecture across the country, and his major completed works include, in Toronto, the Bahan Centre at the University of Toronto, the Governor General Medal-winning York University Student Centre, and the Centre for Green Ethics at the Evergreen Brickworks. So please join me in welcoming Michael and the rest of our panel. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, excellent. So, Michael, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you, and perhaps with Brigitte as well, because the two of you have been involved in, heavily involved in the city's design review panels. Brigitte said a couple of fairly provocative things in there, one of which was, to set the aspiration to have, as Phyllis Lambert put it, that new buildings should represent the best of our society. But at the same time, you said, Brigitte, that there's been a lot of building, but not necessarily a lot of architecture in what we've seen today. So to Michael and to Brigitte, what is standing in the way of individual buildings in this city being great? What are the obstacles to great architecture in the city right now?
I would say that we've had great planning, and that's led to the livability that the city has today. And planning is design neutral. When you have great planning, it's like a program for the building. Truthfully, in the 10 years that I've been on the design review panel, there's been really, I would say, a handful, maybe 10 projects that we've seen where we can say that's inspiring. And while many others have been competent, very few have been inspiring. I think that the idea of having a design review panel to begin with, starting in 2007, was a stroke of genius, and I'm very happy to have been part of it. But I have to say that the majority of the conversation that we've had in the last 10 years has been largely on urban design. So it could have been called the Urban Design Review Panel, much less so on the quality of the architecture. It's not that we've been prevented from doing that. The issue has been that the projects that come before us are so complex, have so many urban issues to resolve, and in the 25 or 30 minutes we have to talk about them, we're really trying to unravel that. So I would say the opportunity to spend more time talking about design at the design review panel, more engagement with the development community, more engagement with our colleagues and peers as architects, would make a much bigger difference. So I think engagement, and also I think we have, we need to learn from the successful examples and bring those examples to the rest of the community. So engagement and making sure that lessons learned, good lessons learned, are shared by all.
And repeated. Brigitte?
I would say education is really key. In Chicago, every cab driver has an opinion about every building in the city. They can tell you what they like, what they don't like, what was better, because they're really informed. They know their buildings. And I feel like I would agree with Michael. We have really great planning that sets the table, lays the foundation. But to get great architecture, we actually need really great clients. And I would say that we are a developer city still. So the reason I use the City Hall is that it really stands out at so many levels in what its aspirations were at the outset. It's not just a building, it's a public space, and the relationship between all of those is very complex, but really, really important. I would say that our development community has done good and competent work, but I would say if it were to step up, it would also really make a huge difference to the quality of architecture in the public realm. And architecture contributes to the public realm. So we have okay buildings that follow general rules, but we could do better.
All right, that was a call to action. I hope you all heard it. Jennifer, a related question perhaps has to do with process and how we encourage excellence. The way the planning process works in Toronto is that the focus of approvals is buildings are approved one by one. and for all of the thought that planning and urban design put into various policies and guidelines, an individual approval often comes down to a specific kind of negotiation over a particular site. But a lot of what you talked about, and a lot of what Adam spoke about as well, has to do with a different scale, with the neighborhood or the block. And it seems to me as though the city doesn't necessarily have good tools for planning adjacent sites together, getting different developers or different actors to work together to build something that is sort of greater than the sum of its parts. Would you agree? And what can we do about that? How can we bring people together to create something that is more coherent and is better?
Well, I would agree with some caveats, and Brigitte's point is a really important one, which we are a developer-driven city. We very much are. Very different from other cities where you, in fact, have a much stronger regulatory framework, where the standards are set by the city, and where there's a requirement to build in keeping with those standards. We, in fact, go through a negotiated process. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's a very complex city, and we're able to engage in complex negotiations on really sophisticated projects in a relatively short period of time, which is one of the reasons why the city is growing so quickly. And I think the Honest Ed site is a really fabulous example of that, where in a very short period of time, in a tight urban context with really deeply ingrained constituencies adjacent to that context, we were able to get to yes in a relatively short period of time, a very short period of time by almost any standard imaginable. And I hold great hopes for that project continuing to take the kind of excellence that went into the process to the execution phase. We have some tools that are very useful to us, and then we have other tools that we're trying to get our hands on. We have secondary plans. The process that we're doing with TO Core right now that has led to Rail Deck Park, as an example, is a secondary planning process that is precisely about looking at a whole variety of sites in relation to each other. The development permit system is a tool whereby you do look at an area and put policies for that specific area in place. Now, we brought forward a recommendation to amend the official plan to enable the city to use the development permit bylaw system. We brought that forward back in 2015. But of course, it was appealed to the Ontario Municipal Board, where it now sits, and it has sat for several years, appealed by the development industry. And one of the challenges there is that that is about putting a clearer regulatory framework in place. And the tension that we have in our city is that on the one hand, we want more regulations, and on the other hand, we don't, depending on where you sit on that spectrum. And it's an incredible tension. And with respect to design excellence, this is where I couldn't agree more with Brigitte, that building a culture of design excellence, even building consumers who demand design excellence, would fundamentally change the industry. If you had consumers who weren't willing to live with crap, who had more sophistication with respect to what they demanded out of their buildings, is a really important part of transforming the industry, particularly in a developer-driven industry, in a market-driven industry. So I think there's a variety of ways into this problem. Planning tools are a piece of it, but there is a whole variety of ways that we can begin to transform the culture around design excellence. The design review panel has been an absolutely critical part of that. But there is, I love it that Brigitte said, we need better clients. And, I was in consulting for a long time, and the quality of your outcome is it's a marriage with your client. But on the other hand, I think, I throw some of that back on the architectural community. And when I've challenged some architects about some of the product that they've brought to us in city planning, and we go like, what on earth? And they hem and haw and scuffle their feet, and they blame it on their client. And I think the industry needs to stiffen its spine and actually say, you know what? We have a civic obligation. And this is part of what we do in city planning every day, is stiffening our spine. And I think there is a role for the architectural community to actually be pushing back with respect to what they're willing to produce and what they're willing to accept from their colleagues.
It's an interesting point. Michael, let me put this to Adam and then to Michael, because you're probably the two members of the panel who have the most experience doing developer projects along with other types of projects. Adam, for you first, your office has done bits and pieces of developer work, and you've managed to, from as I know, people might not, but I know that you've managed to produce some interesting things. You are producing some very interesting projects that go far beyond sort of what is the minimum or what anybody would expect. So, how do you help make the case to your clients for unusual design or better design, or simply trying harder to improve certain aspects of their projects in a qualitative sense? How do you make that argument for putting in the work and putting in the extra money towards a more nuanced and a better product?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to that. Maybe we could do it more. Okay, it comes back to value. It comes back to valuing public realm as part of a proposition. It really depends on, I don't want to say client because that just got debunked, but it depends on someone who comes to you that wants to make a difference, and then there's something there. So, when you're trying to find a match with the kind of project where you can make a difference, you're almost, in some ways, they're coming to you, and in other ways, you're actually auditioning them that they can actually carry through and do something different. I think we proved in Toronto there is value in terms of addressing the public realm. I don't think that's a taboo anymore. I think what that value turns into is yet to be entirely considered. So what does it get someone to address it seriously? Well, it may get a more collaborative process with the city, but then there's always the OMB that you can go to. It may up the bar in terms of the value that they can then pass on to who's purchasing it, and we think that's a very, very real thing. I wish that we could, one of the things is like, how do you capture that? Well, we're very good in Toronto at regulating what we don't want. So we have regulations which kind of, they push out the crap, frankly. But you can set, the bar is about set in the middle. And to go above it gets us into slightly uncomfortable territory. So that's what we're kind of fighting against, is how do you produce exceptional? Because actually some of the most interesting parts of cities are the things that go against the rules.
You go against the rules, yeah.
Right. So we have to have rules, and we have to have design review panels, because some things that come to us, I think, as Michael said, they're bad. Like they're quite fundamentally flawed, so they can be pushed away. We can help there. When we get into most interesting conversations is when there's something that challenges us to say, well, do we like this? And maybe that's a critical point where some really exciting work can happen. It's not when everyone agrees. Actually, the most interesting work happens when there's actually differences of opinion on a panel, when we're actually challenging ourselves to say, is this really what we want to do?
Yeah. What is good? What do we collectively think is good? Michael?
I'd add to that by saying that what I loved hearing in your talk, Jennifer, was thinking of the accelerated growth, the unprecedented growth, making us look at things completely differently than we did before. And I think that is also true of the design review panel, the panels that take place across the city. Design used to be a conversation that took place between an owner and an architect, and with planning. But the broadening of that conversation has changed, I think fundamentally changed the design culture. We're seeing things very differently now than we did when we started in 1997 or 98.
The work is better?
That's right, 2007 or 2008, pardon me.
Right.
There is a respect for the conversation that is going to be taking place, and a respect for the need to explain the origins of your design. Having said that, the pace of design right now really requires people to retool that conversation and retool the way that their imagination is working to be able to provide design excellence at this pace. It is a very challenging environment to provide design excellences. And one of the things that we see probably least of all is appreciation for the context itself. And I'm not talking about it strictly as a historicist. I just mean as an appreciation for all the things that you're going to be influencing as an architect when you bring your new structure or your new design to the table. So immersion in the context and looking for ways in which the architecture and the story can be enriched by knowing it better together with retooling to be in the next generation of architects and imagination specialists. I think those would go a long, long way to making the whole built environment better, and having the conversation be improved as well between all the parties involved.
Jennifer?
Well, I'd like to pick up on some of the themes in what Michael's speaking about here, about the context and how we work with the context. Because one of the things that I think we tend to underestimate as we're beating ourselves up about our city is how well we have absorbed a significant amount of growth in many areas while respecting the character and the context of the city. This is actually something that your work has done exceptionally well, and it's something that we actually are recognized around the world for doing very well. I recently spoke to a group in London, England, and I was encouraged by several different English people to talk about our tall building guidelines precisely because London has done such a horrendous job at building tall buildings because it's all been about the skyline, and they are not in any way integrated into the urban fabric of the city. This is actually something that we figured out, and we've done it exceptionally well. And in many ways, those buildings are the fabric buildings. Even though they're very tall, they are fabric buildings that begin to build out a consistent walkable street edge. And we've actually done that piece very well, and we're recognized internationally for the work that we've done in our tall building guidelines in being able to deliver that. There's another question, which is about when you introduce something new, when is breaking the rules good? And when is breaking the rules actually, there are certain rules you don't want to break because those rules actually are about achieving a public objective. For example, ensuring that your tall buildings aren't so close together that you basically create an absolute wall and block all sky view and create an onerous environment where nothing will grow at grade and where people won't walk at grade. So there are some rules that shouldn't be broken.
Yeah, that 90-story building you guys are dreaming of is not the good kind of rule breaking, right?
Well, it depends on the design of the building. Like I would say, it's not about height, it's about design, and it's about, to Michael's point, it's actually about context. And we take a very nuanced approach to context. There are some areas where a 12-story building is too tall and it doesn't work. And there's other areas where a 12-story building is way too small and we need a taller building. And all of that comes down to understanding adjacencies and understanding the street edge. So we do take this very, very nuanced approach, in part because we do understand context so well, and it's something that we're hypersensitive to because we are trying to create that continuous street edge and that continuous pedestrian environment that still allows for sunlight on our walkable pedestrian streets.
So that's complex. That's a lot of complex ideas, and a lot of them are quite subjective. And as Michael was saying a moment ago, or suggesting a moment ago, what constitutes good design is not necessarily clear, even to a panel of professionals. So, I mean, let me put this to, I guess, to Jennifer, but if anyone else would like to join in, that would be helpful. If I'm a developer and I'm bringing a project for approval, does excellent architecture and excellent urban design help me? Will I be rewarded for thinking about approaching the city with a sense of social responsibility and trying to bring a good project? Is it worth it for me to do that, and how so?
So that's a really important question. We begin with the fundamentals. So you can't actually have excellence in architecture if you didn't get the site organization right. So the site organization, the massing has to come first, and we see the architecture as an overlay on top of that. And we actually find ourselves in this interesting position where we don't actually want to design the building. We want to leave the design of the building up to the architects, and we recognize that that's something that's highly subjective. We're more concerned with not style, and we would never ask for the replication of a building, a 70s buildings. We believe all buildings should be of their time, including in heritage preservation. We would never say replicate that 1970s building. In fact, every building we want to be of its time, and we want it to be of a high quality. And then we really leave the design, the aesthetic of the building up to the architect, because that's really the role of the architect. And we get ourselves in pretty dicey waters if we start trying to design buildings. We want to be very careful not to actually go down that role. I'll give you an example. When I first met with Westbank to talk about the Honest Ed site, and we're talking about high-level considerations, I said my primary consideration for this site is the size of the site and ensuring that if we accommodate a significant amount of density on this site, how do we do that in a way that the architecture respects the fine-grained nature of Bloor Street, and the architecture can be used as a tool to break down the scale of the site and to make it feel like it fits within the fabric of the city, because the scale of the site doesn't fit within the fabric of that neighborhood at all. How could the architecture be a tool to begin to deliver on that character? And I have to tell you, when I saw the very first rendering of it, I gasped. And I'm not an architect, but I went, that's it. That's how you do it. So I threw out, which I think is our role, the principle of what it was we were seeking to achieve. And the architect came back with a solution to respond to that principle. And that was a design challenge, and that design challenge belonged in the hands of the architect. Now, what belonged in our hands was we had some pretty strong opinions about the heritage and wanting to see the heritage preserved. We had pretty strong opinions about the amount of public space, about the character of the street, the massing of the building, because that's our role in planning. But the design, in keeping with those key principles we sought to achieve, we pushed that back over to the architect.
But I also think when design review is actually working really well, I do think it actually operates at the level of urban design. I think that, again, like you were describing, Jennifer, it isn't about telling the architects that this color is better than this, or this opening is better than that. It's actually really there as a kind of different view on the kind of how well it's addressing the urban context, how well it understands the neighborhood that it's situated in. And I feel sometimes that it's a line you actually shouldn't cross at design review, to actually comment on the kind of really fine design issues, if at the kind of level of its understanding and ability to synthesize the urban context is actually really good. Where you get into really sticky water is when they're actually not that good architects. Yeah. And then you have to actually be prescriptive, which is exactly what you don't want to do.
Exactly.
And you have to kind of like spell it out really clearly, and they still don't get it. And then it's really, then it's a problem. And because I teach all the time, you sort of look, is this an A project, a B project, a C project, a D project, or an F project? And you see all of them all the time, right? So. I
was going to add to that, Alex, and say, without a doubt, when a project comes before us and you see design excellence, there is a trust that is immediately there about the possibility that this group can put together a project which serves the public realm, which is going to fulfill on the promise of the design. And there's no question that it opens up your imagination to the possibility that even if it breaks some rules, that they're going to be broken in a good way.
Well, I mean, that leads me to another question, which is this. Should the city be, and I'll put this to you, Michael, should the city be clearer about what it wants? Should there be, Jennifer, you said that nobody wants, people want either less or more regulation. But Michael, would it be useful in urban design terms and architectural terms for the city to be clear about what constitutes good design, so that every time a new project comes in for approval and goes into this process of negotiation, that the wheel is not being reinvented?
Well, the city has got urban design awards every year that have been trying to put forward what its values are. And so could it do more? You can always do more. But if you wanted to show someone the last 5 years of urban design awards and say, this is what we're looking for, this is where we're headed, I don't think it would be much of a mystery, frankly.
Adam.
Keep going.
No, go ahead.
Cut you off.
No, that's good.
Okay. I just was going to say as well, picking up on that I think what the city can do, and I think they're trying to do, is to take the conversation about design excellence beyond the design of a building. So in the design of a building, there's definitely regulation that can be put in place in terms of its form and its response to the public realm. But I agree with you that you can only go so far in prescribing what you think excellence is. I think what the city can do is start to more clearly state the broader goals for its interconnected public realm. So rather than the design of a park or the design of a street, to start thinking broadly beyond an official plan level, but into real spatial design about how the fabric of the city is going to be. To us, that's design excellence, and buildings play a part, streets play a part, laneways play a part, parks play a part. Not again in the specific design of those things, but in how they're going to work together to answer, I guess, the central question of this panel is what kind of a city do we want to be?
So to set a context then, to set a frame for proposals to come, in which proposals can come forward, something for them to respond to.
Exactly. Like a lot of the time when we're dealing with either a developer or a neighborhood group, they're just trying to understand the framework they're trying to operate in and the broader goals. So not just the goals for that site or the guidelines which dictate what that building is within that site, but how does it work in the bigger picture? I know we have secondary plans, but if we can, through TO Core, set a broader goal for reimagining the city as a public realm rather than a skyline, I think that would be transformative for us. I think that would make a huge difference.
Well, Jennifer, I know that some of what Adam was just talking about is in fact the intent of TO Core to start thinking holistically about how the downtown is evolving, and that's a very ambitious vision. First of all, does the city have the right sort of tools that it needs to follow through on that vision? And second of all, how can the industry, or how should the industry be thinking about those goals? If I'm a developer and I'm trying to address this, long list of interlinked goals and objectives, where do I begin? How do I productively start to think about that when I'm putting together a proposal?
So a couple of pieces to that. The first is that I think we have many of the tools. I'm very hopeful, and I chatted briefly with the Premier this morning after she was on stage about this. We've been working with the province on OMB reform, and she made it very clear that she believes in the local jurisdiction and the importance of a local jurisdiction having the discretion to make up the rules. And I think that OMB reform, as it comes forward, all the clues that we've been getting from the province is that it is going to be really transformative in terms of the way it will change our planning processes. So I'm extremely optimistic about that. In addition to that...
is everybody optimistic about that?
We'll all see. We must be optimistic. We have to. We spend thousands and thousands of hours a year defending policies that have already been through a 2-year public consultation process, that have already been approved by City Council because one person wanted more density on that site. It's a complete absurdity, right, that we end up doing that. So, it would be transformative to how we function in the city planning department and where we allocate our resources in the city in city planning. So we have to be optimistic about that opportunity. At the same time, there are some tools that we already have that we're using better. So heritage conservation districts. We are better using heritage conservation districts than we ever have been before, because they're one of our most powerful tools to ensure that change happens in a way that is in keeping with the character that we value in a given area. And we have, at any given time, we have 5 heritage conservation districts that are underway and that are being developed. So that's a very important tool. Our secondary plans are very important tools. The work that we're doing right now around Midtown in Focus, just to give you an example, we were able to secure, through the approvals process, we were able to secure the setbacks to increase the pedestrian realm, which was an idea that came out in that planning process before City Council and approved. We were able to start integrating that into our discussions with developers and securing a better public realm instantly, even before it became a regulatory tool. So it's important to recognize that that negotiated process does create a lot of space when we're working with true city builders and true collaborators. And remember, that's not everyone, which is why we do end up at the board. But I would say most of our biggest and most significant developers in the city truly care passionately about city building outcomes and work in a very collaborative way with us.
And the more built examples there are of these precincts of the city that actually work better, the more confidence, the more optimism, the more you don't need to say it so many times.
That's right.
You can just point. And people are living there and enjoying their neighborhoods.
Well, we are almost out of time, so I want to say thanks to all the panelists. It was a pleasure being here, and I want to say thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to you, Eli.
On behalf of the City of Toronto, again, I want to thank everybody who sat through this afternoon's discussion, and a special thank you to our panelists. It was really a very invigorating conversation, and thank you, Alex, for moderating us. This has been a tremendously stimulating day for all of us. Thanks again.
Just so we can get her to